A response to the Tea Act. First, there are numerous questions that Parliament and us as a class, we have to kind of consider in the time of 1774. Remember, to set the stage here, December 1773 is the Tea Act, but Parliament really gets wind of it beginning in January 1774. There are rumors going back across the Atlantic that this had actually happened, and a lot of it, as far as the English reaction of the people and the members of Parliament, is simply disbelief. Had that really happened? Are these rumors true? And that leaves us with a number of questions. First of all, had Boston, again, in Parliament's reaction, there's going to be a reaction, had Boston isolated itself by being the major force of dumping tea in the harbor? There had been other smaller tea parties. There had also been the act that several colonies had sent the tea ships back. Was there going to be a reckoning in England for that as well? Had Boston kind of set itself apart, would they have to stand alone? And we're going to find out the answer to that question is really no. No. And even the people within Massachusetts, John Adams and others, are asking that question. Oh dear, what had we done? And will we be punished alone? And if we are punished alone, how will or if the other colonies would actually react? Would the king and Parliament respond to any petitions that might come out of Massachusetts and the kind of shadow government that they're going to have to create? And the answer to that is actually no as well. They appeal both to Parliament, the king, and the people in the course of 1774. Again, who will intervene? That's another unknown. And maybe bring Parliament back to their senses. And to do that, they draft at the First Continental Congress a Declaration of Rights. We're going to go into detail about what those Declaration of Rights actually stated. From that, of course, the Declaration of Rights was we might say, a conglomeration of different submissions that came from Virginia and from Massachusetts, one of them being the Suffolk Resolves. So we are hitting on things you're going to read about in the book. Again, we're outlining it now. We're going to get into the real specifics when you read the story of Bunker Hill, Massachusetts, and everything that happens in the resistance. Okay, so the official reports of the Tea Act reaches London in January 1774. And by the way, in the colonies, tea unifies the colonies. That the Tea Party is not the word they actually used. The incident in Boston, the destruction of the tea. So sometime decades later, the actual Boston Tea Party phrase to describe what happened in December 1773, it kind of is what we use for that incident, but they didn't call it that in 1774. But it unifies the colonies unlike anything had since the Stamp Act 8 years before. Again, there was some unity over the Coercive Acts. There was an effort that was very successful to stop importing British goods. But then we had the quiet period. We had the question about whether or not there should be a need to continue the non-importation agreements. There was, as we're going to find out, boycott fatigue. Can we do it again? Is it going to hurt the economy so much in the colonies that it's not worth instituting it? And if you do institute boycotts, will it be across the different colonies, and will it link the cities to the countryside? All unknown. That's why they ask these questions after what Parliament does in the course of 1774 with the Coercive Acts. There's more and more a feeling among members of Parliament that the colonists had to be dealt with severely. Otherwise, they would become independent. They would have to make Boston obey. And they would have to make an example out of Boston. Part of the wrath we know was taken out on Benjamin Franklin when he was brought in front of Parliament, and we understand that at first it was to consider, Franklin thought it was to consider the petition to remove Thomas Hutchinson as governor of Massachusetts. That's why he thinks he's there. Then he gets some whispers from his friends that no, it's about the certain packet of letters that have come to the attention of members of Parliament that you sent back to people in Massachusetts and told them not to publish, and they went and published them anyway. And he said, okay, maybe I should get legal representation, which he does. and they tell him that's probably a good idea to present yourself in front of members of the Privy Council. The other part of the story I wasn't familiar with, but again, was again, listening as I do, and I've given you assignments for the podcast because they're really, really useful. That several duels, one duel was fought and almost a second duel was fought over people who are rumored to have leaked the letters. Franklin hears about the second duel and says, look, I got to just basically turn myself in and admit that I did this before any innocent individuals are harmed. And so he goes there, and that's when they let fly. I mean, he stands there for an hour just by himself, motionless, not saying anything, not able to answer any of these charges, and pretty unkind words that are thrown at him by effectively the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn. And I think it more than anything else, we said this last time, it reflects the frustration of members of Parliament. I mean, they are just getting the information about the Tea Party, and then Franklin comes in, and there you have it. I mean, it's a chance for them. They can't go to the colonies and just vent at the people of Boston. They've got to then, of course, take their frustration out on Franklin, and they do that. They do that in spades. They truly do. There is an overall feeling among the ministry, the advisors to the king in 1774, that the lawlessness in the colonies has to be stopped. They must suffer. They have to be shown who's in charge. Where's sovereignty? Is it in the colonial legislatures or these resistance that's meeting, or is it actually with Parliament? Parliament was blindsided. They truly were. The English people were blindsided by what took place. Even Franklin said, the quote I used last time, the stockholders of the British East India Company are not our enemy. Then he gets called in to the Privy Council and dressed down by Alexander Wedderburn, and hides out for a few days because he thinks he's going to get arrested. And then he's immediately fired as Postmaster General, because you really can't leak private letters and expect to keep that job. And he decides in the next year he's going to leave England for good, calling it a rotten country. And basically arguing that at first, I had been even surprised by the level of animosity towards the Tea Act, but he's a full-fledged rebel by 1775. Okay, so there is an overall feeling in Parliament. Some measure or measures, they're favoring measures now, have to be implemented that they can remind the people in the American colonies who is in charge. Where is sovereignty? Is it with the colonial legislatures who are splitting hairs, saying in certain areas Parliament can make decisions and others they can't? Or does sovereignty totally exist in Parliament? This is what they're going to finally solve once and for all by a series of measures. The measures are passed. We often lump them together into one group, and we call them, the Parliament called them, the Coercive Acts of 1774. They were called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts, because if you read the details of them, they are completely and totally intolerable. But it is a five-part measures, 5 parts, meant to single out Boston and serve as a stern warning to all the other colonies. You do this and you can expect to see something similar to the Coercive Acts to apply to New York, South Carolina, New Hampshire, whatever the colony is, must, of course, involved in that. The first part of the Coercive Acts close the port of Boston. It is part of what they call the Boston Port Bill. And it moved the government out of Boston to an area that would eventually be Salem, as you're going to read about in the Philbrick book. And even Salem isn't a place that isn't safe from the influence of the resistance. So you take it out of Boston because Boston is, again, very much influenced by the people, a population of about 16,000 in 1774. So you take it out there and it can meet somewhere else, maybe even be insured by the safety of the soldiers. But closing the port of Boston, when you look at that in detail, what does it mean? Well, basically ocean-going ships cannot travel in and out of Boston. The only exception made, because they're not cruel, the English, are for food and fuel. Again, they're not going to starve the people there. So firewood is what they mean. Firewood coming in from other places outside the colony of Massachusetts, and food. But in general, ocean-going vessels, items that are coming from different colonies, if it is trade items, or from overseas, again, banned. It will remain and stay closed, the Port of Boston, until the king decides he will open it again. And the king's going to decide to open it again when the tea's paid for. By the way, in modern dollars, I saw a figure. It's about $800,000 worth of tea. So it's close to $1 million in modern money. That, again, equivalents for currency today and back then are difficult. But that's a number I saw, and we're going to go with that. 800,000 pounds sterling or $800,000, whatever you want to call it. Again, a significant amount. Just to put it into perspective of what kind of real money in today's equivalent we're talking about. The Boston Port Bill sailed through the House of Commons. No opposition. No one standing up saying, maybe this isn't a good idea. Even those who were sympathetic with the colonists over issues like the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, those folks were for it as well. MPs, meaning members of parliament, if you ever see that two-letter expression. MPs who thought, well, I sympathize with the rights of colonists. Nah, they're even in the mood to isolate and punish Massachusetts. So this is the beginning of what the Americans will call the Intolerable Acts, and they happen over the next 3 months. So they pass a series of laws. This is legislation introduced in Parliament, the People's Representative of Great Britain, and approved by the King. They go through Commons and Lords in Parliament. So there's overwhelming support for these measures. The successive parts of the Intolerable Acts are meant to alter the government of Massachusetts. So first, close the port. Then, put the government back in the hands of loyal officials in Massachusetts. First, it formally turned the colony into a royal affair. Now, already we know that Thomas Hutchinson, as governor, was appointed by the king, but there are other parts of the government that the responsibilities are shared by the colonists and the king. And they're often, and again, forces that are butting heads. You have the king's representative in the governor, but you also have the governor's council. That council would be now chosen by the crown, not the people in the legislature. So it was making, to say it differently, the government of Massachusetts much more of a royal affair. Now, the people would still choose the representatives to what's called the general court. That's the legislature of Massachusetts. The legislatures went by different names. The Pennsylvania Assembly, the Massachusetts General Court, the Virginia House of Burgesses, they had different names. It's not mandated by Parliament that thou shall all be named one style of legislature, not at all. And how those individuals' government operated, we know, depended on the colony. Sometimes the people chose the council, kind of the upper chamber in each individual colony's government. Sometimes it was chosen by the governor. In this case, they're taking it out of the hands of the people in Massachusetts and saying that the crown, the king, will choose these group of counselors around the royal governor. Town meetings, again, this is part of called within the Intolerable Acts. This is the Massachusetts Government Act. So you've got the Boston Port Bill and you've got the Massachusetts Government Act. They will also, again, under this regulation, town meetings within the colony only take place with permission of the governor. Juries will now be also selected by sheriffs, chosen by the governor. So they're taking the forces that can create resistance out of the hands of the legislature or the people. That's why this element of the Coercive Acts is very controversial. Town meetings can only take place with permission of the governor. This is the very core, the marrow, you might say, the part of your bones in the middle that are so important. The marrow of the Massachusetts government going back to the Puritan days in the 1620s is the town meeting. Now that can only happen with the pre-approved permission of the royal governor. This, in turn, reduces the effect of this immediately is the reduction of the local control of the colony. And as far as the English Parliament was concerned, it removed the possibility or the danger of the rabble running the government. You take it out of the city, only local meetings are done by the permission of the governor. More officials are appointed, not by and elected, but chosen by the royal governor. Any royal official accused of a capital crime could choose to be tried in England. This is, I believe it was called the Administration of Justice Act. The colonists had a name for it, the Murder Act. The colonists' interpretation of that part of the Coercive Acts was, oh, okay, it's open season on the colonists. The Murder Act. If you committed a capital crime, one by which the government could take your life away, you could say, no. I'm not going to go with the whole option of a jury of colonists who all want to kill me. I'm going to go over and see me executed. I'm going to have my jury chosen by English folks in England, where, of course, no English jury would convict that person of murder. That's why it was called the Murder Act, not because it meant the murder of the person accused of the crime, but it literally created a climate by which colonists thought, oh, okay, we are susceptible to the worst crimes, the worst one, of course, murder, and you're never going to see a conviction because those trials, obviously the accused will say, yeah, I'm going to up and take my actual trial in England, where I'll have a friendly jury of sympathetic fellow Englishmen, and the end result will be not guilty. So you can see all of this. This is the series over the last several months that will change the government and change the way things are done in the colony. Then there will be a new quartering act, which will provide that troops could be put in empty, unused buildings, even the possibility of private homes. This is a first, and this is an innovation. The Quartering Act had been around. We talked about resistance to it by the colony of New York until they eventually caved. But this new Quartering Act was something different, and it got the attention of the people in Massachusetts. Then, of course, things got even worse as far as the colonists were concerned. I'm going to open up the share tray here and look at our slide. Here we go. Okay. It wasn't part of the Coercive Acts, but in 1774, colonists also reacted to what Parliament passed in the form of the Quebec Act, the Quebec Act of 1774. As we know, this area of the world, Quebec, formerly the French colony of New France, fell under the control of the British at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. The colonists, again, perception and reality, I say this again and again. The perception to the colonists was this is just another part of the Coercive Acts. It wasn't. It made sense for the English. It was part of their reforms. The Quebec Act, as you can see on the map here. Now, why would Quebec apply and actually include what we now recognize as areas of America? Well, colonial, by that I mean the colonies, what's now the United States. The Quebec Act enlarged the boundary of Quebec south to the Ohio River and over to the Mississippi River. It's a huge addition. Further, the area would be governed by an appointed governor, not so much a military man anymore, but someone chosen. The governor would then have a council, but no elected assembly. So it's giving more independence as far as the role of government and the people involved in the government to Quebec, which as far as the French and English in Canada were concerned was a good thing. It's not a good thing as far as the American colonists were concerned. It also gave the Catholic Church the same privileges in the boundaries of Quebec as the church enjoyed under the time when this was part of France. This is where the fear started in the American colonies. Take a look at this slide. Catholic bishops dancing at the reaction. This is a cartoon from the 1774. There's the Quebec bill at underneath the feet of the Catholic bishops. And as far as they were concerned, it was extending Canadian jurisdiction. First, let's go back to the slide, all over lands that they fought France over. Look at what we're talking about. We're talking about the Ohio country, as the Virginians, Pennsylvania, and Marylanders would recognize. The Ohio River, there's Western Pennsylvania. They can say Pittsburgh at the very western boundary there. So you can forget about ever using that land. I mean, they already knew they couldn't sell it, rent it under the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This seemed to add to the idea that, oh gosh, the English really, really want to prevent us from ever expanding. They want to contain us on the other side of the Ohio River. These lands had been claimed by Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Virginia. Connecticut had claims on what's now Michigan. It's a confusing whole thing going back to the old colonial charters. So the question was asked by colonists, and it's an obvious one. How could this land ever be opened up and developed if England was going to just give it to Canada? The other problem they had, which is really not a rational fear, but they said it anyway. They said things like, if France were ever to reestablish themselves in North America, like win back Canada, they're going to win back Quebec, they're going to think is everything that extends in this map. And it's game over for expansion or any kind of future by which the generations of children and grandchildren in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland can give away this land, sell this land, or rent this land. So an appointed government, an appointed governor, an appointed council without any elected legislature, that also creates kind of a dangerous precedent, which they think, oh, this is the way England's going to develop if they ever open up new colonies in the West. And so what the Quebec Act did, even though it's independent of the Coercive Acts, what it essentially does is say, all right, we're now tapping into the worst fears that the American colonists have. The idea that you can tamper with the charters of government, you can even tamper with the religious practices of the colonies. The colonists are overwhelmingly Protestant. Many people in New England, remember, had fled England because England under the Anglican Church was awfully Catholic. It's Anglican in name only, but a lot of the practices like bishops and archbishops and the sacraments, again, mirror the Catholic Church. So that's why you have thousands of Congregationalists, also known as Puritans, fleeing England and other religious dissenters, Presbyterians and other Protestants. Anglicans, of course, are the official church religion, and that's why you see an offshoot in the 1740s and 50s of the rise of the Baptist faith, the Methodist faith, and the Presbyterian faith. So again, this absolutely brought up Americans' worst fears. You begin to tamper with the charters of government. It goes back to the ideas expressed first in the Townsend duties. I mean, take the ability of the colonial legislators to pay the salaries of the royal officials. So it's building, all by itself, it's building the case of what England is trying to do, subvert and subjugate the colonial governments. There's now a fear after the Quebec Act that, well, once this legislation is passed, and it did go through, England would finally send official bishops to North America and make it official. In fears of that going back to the 1760s, the Massachusetts and New England community had a whole rumor mill about this happening at the end of the French and Indian War. Their worst fears, they all were revived over the Quebec Act. This was a way to weaken other new denominations in North America, those that had been established by the Great Awakening, like the growth of the Presbyterian faith in New England, which was quickly rivaling the Congregational or Puritan faith. And of course, with these new church structure and infrastructure, they would have to be taxes imposed to pay their salaries, which would not at all be determined or voted on by the individual colonial governments. Again, a vast conspiracy was afoot as far as the Americans were concerned. Even Anglicans weren't really keen on this idea because you were giving special rights to non-Protestants in Canada. It puts their church on equal footing. And even Anglicans can see that's a problem. Anglicans thought, look, we reformed the Catholic Church and the abuses of it and what we saw as things that could be fixed with it, with the settlement and creation of Henry VIII's Anglican Church. We're happy Anglicans. We're happy because we're not like those who follow the faith in Spain and in France. So ministers began to tell congregations, we know this because we have the sermons that are printed. New England and all the places in the colonies, very literate, and they keep records. So we have combed the sermons that are being given after 1764, and they talk about the fact and the fear that you, the people of New England and other colonies, will be, and one quote in a sermon says, bound by popish chains in the future. Bound by referring to the Pope. P-O-P-I-S-H, popish chains in the future under the Quebec Act. Well, this might have, of course, heightened the reaction and really caused a great deal of uncertainty and hatred for the Coercive Acts, but it's the Massachusetts Government Act, I think, that was the real thing that very much incited those folks in the American colonies. Trials without juries, trials that would take place in other parts of the English world, not in North America, meant that there would be, as I said before, open season on the colonists. Their fate would be decided overseas. And of course, if the charters of Massachusetts, the old 1691 charter that had been put in place and first made Massachusetts a royal colony, if they could be that quickly, at the whim of Parliament, changed, abrogated would be the word, just completely done away with, was any colony that dumped tea or turned the tea ships around and refused to have the tea sold in their colony, was any colony that had done that safe? So here's Parliament's goal. Isolate Massachusetts, punish Boston. The reaction in the colonies? No. It can happen to us too. It backfires. Parliament's goals backfire. Sam Adams swung into action as leaders of the Boston Radicals right away and began to try to talk about the idea of shutting down all trade with Great Britain. More boycotts? May not be exactly the stomach for that in 1774. Maybe they should call a meeting instead, institute the committees of correspondence, swing into action and begin to discuss, open up the idea with other colonies about whether or not they'd be willing to have some kind of meeting in one place to air their grievances, talk about where they stand over constitutional issues, and then come up with a strategy. Those ideas now, we're talking about spring 1774, as more and more of these different parts of the Coercive Acts go into effect. It starts with the Boston Port Bill, and then over 6 months, more measures are announced and, of course, cross the Atlantic and come into the American colonies. There are more reasons to remain steadfast in May 1774. It is announced that the former governor, well, now former governor, Thomas Hutchinson, will be replaced by General Gage. Yeah, the new governor of the colony of Massachusetts is the man who's in charge of all the soldiers in North America. Governor Thomas Gage, governor/general or general/governor, whatever you'd like to call him. Boston merchants, even with this news, are somewhat divided. Should we go on and enforce boycotts? It's going to hurt the economy that's been struggling for 10 years since the end of the French and Indian War. So in this setting, the committees of correspondence stay in touch and write other committees of correspondence in different colonies about what the next course of action might be. Their overall consensus, meaning agreement among the different committees of correspondence, some meeting has to take place. Something had to be done across the different colonies to respond to the intolerable acts. Governor Gage, by the way, you'll get some good information about him. Let's set his story very briefly. This is someone who had been in the colony since 1754. So he arrives there. He's with Braddock in Washington when Braddock defeat happens in the second year of the French and Indian War. He had been there for quite a number of years, basically almost 20 years. He had taken over as commander of all the armed forces in North America at the end of the French and Indian War when the king recalled Jeffrey Amherst. Amherst was the one who a lot of people pinned Pontiac's rebellion on. So it's Gage who has to clean up the mess. The 18 months where the British forces have to fight and retake these forts that had fallen to Pontiac's allies. In that intervening years, by the time he left England in 1754 and the end of the French and Indian War, we know he married a young lady from New Jersey, and so he's married to an American. So you can see that he has some connections and even some sympathies to the American cause, but he had been steadfast now, and that is why he's in charge, at least for the time being. But in our discussion over the next couple of days and reading the Philbrick book, you're going to understand that Gage has never dealt with, the British have never dealt with anything like this. He starts shifting soldiers into Boston. He starts reinforcing the area of land between Boston and the mainland. Boston, as I said before, look at the first couple pages of the Philbrick book. Boston is almost an island. It's called a neck. It is a thin stretch of land. Boston now has been landfill, has been used to make it look like it's more of the actual state of Massachusetts. But back then, it was literally an island with a thin piece of land that connected it to the mainland. He reinforces Boston Neck. He begins to shift soldiers from New York and Nova Scotia into Boston. So he has upwards in 1774 of about 3,000 soldiers in the city. He begins to deploy them back into the city. They had at one point been in a fort outside the city. He begins to use them to enforce the regulations of the Coercive Acts. And then Gage left for America to report back to England in 1773. Gage is at the meeting where Franklin is just obliterated in front of the Privy Council, and then he returns back. He gives, again, kind of an update on what's happening. And then when he gets there, one of the things he does at the end of 1774 is begin to ask for more soldiers. He has 3,000 there. He says it's not enough. Gage will later say by the end of 1774, I need 20,000 minimum. Minimum. He said essentially it's like poking a bear with a stick. It's not effective. And when his bosses back in London get news that this guy needs 20,000 soldiers, number one, he's not going to get them. Number two, maybe we should send someone who's got a little more intestinal fortitude than Thomas Gage. But he's the one who has his pulse on what is happening in Massachusetts more than anyone else. England made a critical mistake with the Coercive Acts. There's no doubt about it. They could have simply passed the Boston Port Act, punish Boston for dumping the tea in the harbor, and leave it alone. But they continued to go on. But the other parts of the parliamentary legislation followed quickly. So in 6 months, Boston's cause, this is the worst thing that can happen if you're England. Boston's cause becomes the other colonies' cause. Not a good development. The Quebec Act was never part of the Coercive Acts, but it's lumped together as the colonists. It doesn't even matter that it's not the truth. The Quebec Act, bringing bishops into North America, that's not going to happen. Doesn't matter, they think it's going to happen. Anything maybe is possible now. That is the condition of the relationship between colonies in late spring, summer, 1774. So what do? You first organize the committees of correspondence. Connecticut acts first. Connecticut says we're going to choose delegates for a meeting of a continental-wide Congress. And that's the name it quickly begins to adopt. Other colonies follow the lead of Connecticut in the summer of 1774. The way they go about it is remarkable and worth mentioning. The governors in several colonies shut down the legislatures when they begin to talk about, in the official government of the colony, who will we send to the meeting that's going to take place? And they're not sure exactly where it might take place. People are leaning towards Philadelphia. In New York and Virginia, the governors of those respective colonies say, that's it, you're done, you're not going to meet anymore. In Virginia, they just walk to Raleigh Tavern. Raleigh Tavern is in Colonial Williamsburg. You can see a reconstruction of it. Taverns created a lot of the American resistance and revolution. It's where you can get a lot of people in a room. People know where it is. You share ideas. Newspapers come in, announcements from overseas in taverns. So even if you don't partake of adult beverages, well, it's a hub of information. Raleigh Tavern, the meeting of the unofficial legislature of Virginia takes place, and they decide who's and what delegates they will send. So extra legal groups, you could say, not sanctioned by the governor, not part of the official government of the actual colony, are responding to these committees of correspondence, and on their own, they're agreeing to send delegates to this Continental Congress. Newspaper writers take the lead already in 1773, even before the calling of the Continental Congress. And they are talking about the concept and the idea of an American Congress of some kind, maybe on equal status. Some of the members of the Continental Congress who will go to the Philadelphia meeting had been writing these ideas in pamphlets. And this is an idea that's 20 years old. It goes back to the American Council of Union that Franklin talked about with the Albany Congress in 1754. The only difference now is it's not this meeting of the Continental Congress about Indian policy, renewing the relationship with the Iroquois Confederacy. That's what the Albany Congress was about. Maybe even formulating a combined colony-wide strategy to fight France. Nope. This is now the common cause of North America. They would always define themselves, these colonies, by their province. We always think of Southerners identify with the South as their region. Everyone does that back then. Everyone did. Whether you are in the middle colonies, in the New England, or in the South. So in June 1st, news of the Port Act had reached the American colonies, and other news of the other parts, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, these all filter in. Again, it doesn't help Parliament's cause that when news comes over about more of these collectively called the coercive acts, it just creates more need to have this meeting. So the First Continental Congress. It's the idea that they will meet, propose a principle of an American Union. It's already out there in 1773 and been around for some time. But in the past, the idea of an American Union had been that we would be subordinate to Great Britain. It's not as much the theme anymore. And the theme of the American Union had been that the colonies would remain in the English system. Maybe not. Maybe not. So who goes and what do they do at the First Continental Congress? They gather in Philadelphia, September 1774. 12 colonies send representatives. Georgia is the only one that does not. There are 56 delegates at the First Continental Congress, average age 45. Just throw out some statistics to tell the story, not critical for y'all to know. Representative of, this is a young population and a young group that gathers in Philadelphia. The representatives are chosen in different ways, whether it be the legislature, the official legislature of the actual colony. At one point, you're going to read about Sam Adams locking the doors of the official legislature while the Crown official pounds on the outside saying this meeting is not condoned by the governor. It met without the permission of the governor. And Sam Adams and company say, yeah, but you can't come inside, so ha-ha. So either a legislature of the colony, a convention, or some committee of correspondence, or a group assembling in a bar. That's the group that chooses the representatives. Most of these assemblies were illegal, but they were carried out anyway. It's the beginning of what we'll call the shadow governments. Shadow governments emerging in each of the colonies. Who was there that we know of? Both Adamses. John and Samuel attend from Massachusetts. George Washington is in attendance, as is Patrick Henry. And from Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, author of Letters from an American Farmer. No one uses the I word yet, independence. Well, maybe a couple are thinking of it, but they don't exactly advertise it. Washington and Adams meet for the first time, John Adams, and it's Washington who says, "What are you all thinking up there in Massachusetts? I hadn't been really supportive of the dumping of the tea. What's the next step? I'm hearing rumors of a separation with Great Britain," and John Adams has to say to Washington, we're not there yet, because we want to construct a strategy and then see what England's response is going to be. You have radicals here at the Continental Congress. You also have a group that wants to stop the radicals. So you have groups of all different, again, middle of the road, moderate, very conservative, who are saying, look, the sovereignty still exists in Parliament. They'll come to their senses. And radicals who say, probably not, it's too late. We know what the next step's going to be, but we've got to work together to have a unified statement come out of this meeting in 1774. The petty squabbles that were often a part of what separated colonies, either it be jealousies, were not aired in this Congress. It's probably a good thing that you want to present a united front. The American colonies at this Congress try to speak with one voice. For many, it was also the first time that folks met other people from different parts of the colonies. John Adams commenting on how fast New Yorkers talked. He made another comment, it was either the first or second Continental Congress, that he met Southerners, Virginians. He said in Virginia, all geese are swans. They obviously think fairly highly of themselves in the South, the old Cavalier tradition, the strongest connection going back to England. But as much as we consider these individuals cosmopolitan, most of them hadn't left their respective colony and traveled that far from outside their own town or city. As the Connecticut delegates point out, we have our own rights and interests to protect at Philadelphia, but others are saying, look, your issues with New York, Connecticut, you're going to have to work them out at another time. Differences within the colonies, North, South Carolina, the aftermath, obviously, the regulator movements, those are going to have to be aired later on. We are here to make a statement in reaction to the coercive acts. So trade rivalries, boundary disputes, religious differences, let's forget about that. Later on, we'll take up those issues. Now it is putting together one coherent answer representing the colonies, 12 of them. 12 of them show up. I mean, the Stamp Act Congress, we had what, 8 or 9? That was pretty good, the best attendance you've had in a long time. So these individuals meet, and they have a couple of suggestions of where they're going to meet. I actually have a slide here. They think maybe the State House in Pennsylvania might be a good idea, but they don't choose that. They think maybe there could be another location within the city of Philadelphia, and they agree on this. This is Carpenter's Hall, recently completed and used by artisans in the Pennsylvania community. So it's big enough to house the delegates there, and they're there for almost 2 months. They're there until the end of October, meeting and discussing what they're going to do. 2 groups emerge at the First Continental Congress, although they want to speak with one voice, and they have their own agenda there. You know, have a very radical response, completely destroy the sovereignty of Parliament. Yeah, that's iffy. The other group that says, no, just have Parliament change the manipulation of each of the individual governments. That would be the best response we can get. We also have to form an appeal to the people, to the king, and the Parliament. We need to petition the individuals who can change England's policy. The first group there at the Continental Congress has the overall view that the colonial legislatures are all powerful and Parliament can't interfere at all. Pretty strong position. The other group, the more conservative group, think Americans have some rights, but Parliament is supreme in the empire. Okay, so how are you going to get a middle ground between these very different groups? You could say that this is the argument, the second argument, Americans have some rights, but Parliament is supreme, most recently articulated by Thomas Hutchinson. The Hutchinson letters had been published not long before, remember. They've been written in the 1768-69 period, but Franklin gets them out there to the Boston Resistance in 1773. So I will emphasize that Hutchinson's view, he's not alone. People at the Continental Congress still think that way. The idea that Parliament is supreme. But other members echo what Hutchinson said. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania is one. So you see a divide here. I mean, Galloway's a little bit older. Galloway makes an argument from Pennsylvania that maybe colonists should have some representatives in Parliament. Maybe that would ease the resistance in the different parts of North America. To which his response by others there are like, well, yeah, that sounds great, but it'll be just like Scotland. Scotland sends representatives to Parliament. About 10% of Parliament is made up of those folks from the northern areas, and they always get outvoted. And England can do whatever it wants to Scotland. Their representatives vote. They don't have enough say to stop it from happening, and then you'll be in that status. And then we won't be able to complain. So Galloway proposes this idea, but it never gets anywhere as far as a statement that comes out of the Continental Congress. Then you see younger hotheads like Sam Adams, who simply deny the right of Parliament in all cases whatsoever. We'll go back and pull up the notes here. So now they're going to have to speak with one voice and make a statement. The first debate, the first issue, is between the different states. Believe it or not, they're going to have to work out how representation works. So in this American Union that they've been talking about in the newspapers for the last year, once we get there, how do we, 12 different colonies, make decisions? Every colony gets one vote. I don't care if Rhode Island sends 3 delegates and Virginia sends 10. Every colony, one vote. Now, what we'll do is, if we've got 3 people from Rhode Island, we'll take the consensus there. 2 or 4, 1 against, that's the statement from Rhode Island. But Rhode Island and Virginia and the Virginians, and this is a sore point for years, for the next, 20 years of representation. They finally agree that every state, every colony, I should say, not state yet, every colony gets one vote. Virginia is on even footing with Rhode Island. They also agree to adopt the Suffolk Resolves. So what statement is going to come out of this, and what action are we going to take? The Suffolk Resolves denounce the Coercive Acts. They were brought to Philadelphia by an express writer named Paul Revere, silversmith, the one who had done, of course, the fabled engraving of the Boston Massacre. The Suffolk Resolves essentially called the Coercive Acts unconstitutional, called for the people to arm themselves, and economic sanctions had to be leveled against Great Britain. They've been written by someone who's going to be a main character in the book, Joseph Warren of Massachusetts. He drafts the Suffolk Resolves. That's where they come from in Massachusetts. I'll highlight a couple points of them. There are actually 19. Don't worry, I'm not going through all 19 of them. But I think it's important to measure because this is one of the early statements. There's going to be another coming from Virginia, but this is the Suffolk Resolves is in front of the Congress, to say it differently. Revere, on horseback, gets there as fast as he can. Once they're written in Massachusetts, delivers them to Philadelphia to see the reaction. Will the Congress adopt some of them, all of them? But at least they frame the argument, the colonial statement on rights. It first said, the Suffolk Resolves, that we have to honor our ancestors who built this free society by living the oppression of England. Again, it's a connection to Hutchinson. Remember what he said? When you cross the Atlantic, you immediately put yourself in a secondary status. Geography, distance, to which the colonists reject that notion. No, our government is the equal of the English government. We never surrendered any rights simply because we carved an existence out of the wilderness in burying the dead family members along the way. That's an interesting statement that they make at the beginning of the Suffolk Resolves. They recognize in the first resolve King George III as a sovereign head of the English nation and empire. So they always start these things this way. We're loyal to the king. Why? Because they think the king might intervene and stop this nonsense. But the colonists, now here's where the colonists are kind of clueless. George III is going along with this. So there's maybe they know it, I don't know. Maybe the colonists know it. And maybe they think George III is the last connection, the loyal connection they have to being all things English. I'm not sure. It's hard to get in the mindset there. But you see this in the documents. You see it even after the shooting starting in Massachusetts, that when they send petitions to the king, they pledge their loyalty to the king. Maybe it's just something to do. I don't know. The second of the resolves says there is a duty among the colonists to fight for their rights. And then they went on to multiple criticisms of the coercive acts. They wouldn't obey them, they say. They're unconstitutional. The appointment of judges, here's how we're going to react to that. The appointment of judges and not the election. We're going to basically ignore all the orders that come out of courts under the new system. If you abide by the courts and try to carry out the actions of the courts, you're the enemy of the people. So now it's treasonous to obey the law in Massachusetts. They're not going to pay any taxes to support the government of the colony. This is the beginning of the insurgency. This is really the big, I mean, it's one thing to declare this and you have to carry it out. So the Continental Congress can say all these things and they can adopt the Suffolk Resolves and they can make another statement we're going to talk about. But actually the people back in the different colonies have to make this a reality. So the taxes, you stop paying your taxes because those taxes are supporting the people that you no longer can choose to represent you. This is borderline treasonous behavior. They demand that the governor's council, chosen by the king, all resign. If you don't, we're going to make life really, really difficult for you. They criticize communications. That Gage probably reads this and laughs at it. The idea that he's bringing cannon and more soldiers into Boston itself. You're going to read in the Philbrick book that Gage loses the countryside. In fact, he retrenches to Boston because it's the only safe place for him. And this is difficult for a military guy. You want to establish intelligence outside of Boston. You can't get it. He moves outside Boston because he thinks it's going to be a nice, safe, quiet place. And he moves back into Boston. He doesn't even feel safe anymore there. Next, the Suffolk Resolves attack the Quebec Act. So they're mentioning everything that's gone on over the last several months. And I'll mention just two more of the, 19 resolves, because it's pertinent to what we're talking about. A lot of them by name just criticize the individual parts of what the colonists are calling the intolerable acts. It calls for a provincial Congress, which is already meeting, obviously. The Suffolk Resolves say, like Connecticut before us, we think there should be some kind of colony-wide assembly, which is already there. The Suffolk Resolves are brought to the Congress, so it's already happened. And of course, this connects directly to Revere, and what you're going to read about in the book and what we know of this story is that there should be established in the colonies different dispatch riders who can go out and bring news of what's happening, communicate city to countryside. Revere is one of them, as we know. There's going to be others. Spread any news as quickly as possible. So they adopt the Suffolk Resolves, which denounce the Coercive Acts. The Suffolk Resolves call the Coercive Acts unconstitutional. As I've said before, call for the people to arm. This is not good news for the English. And to urge economic sanctions. They follow up the Suffolk Resolves with what they call the Declaration of Rights. Now, there's a story to this, the Declaration of Rights. They take a lot of the ideas from something that had been published earlier in 1774. The earlier document was called the Summary View of the Rights of British America. It came out of Virginia, the Summary View of the Rights of British America, written by someone who was not in attendance at the First Continental Congress, but it puts this guy on everyone's radar for the first time, Thomas Jefferson. Writes the Summary View. That's the short version of this. It's called the Summary View. He writes it out of Virginia, and the Summary View, becomes the Declaration of Rights. That's the statement out of the Continental Congress. It challenges Parliament's rights that were first stated in the Declaratory Act. So this is going to build on what the Suffolk Resolves actually did. Laws were founded in the state of nature, life, liberty, and property. The Lockean ideas, life, liberty, and property early on. The British Constitution, colonial charters, and the English were effectively doing away with all of those traditions in the form of the Coercive Acts. Legislatures never, ever gave up the right to tax themselves. That's part, a critical part, of the Declaration of Rights at the Continental Congress. It challenged the idea that revenue measures can be done by Parliament. So it is encapsulating arguments that the colonists have made over the last decade. It objected to the Admiralty courts, where you have no jury. You just go before a judge and you're guilty until proven innocent. That harkens back to 1760 and the search and seizure debates that people like James Otis were talking about. The Declaration of Rights objected to the colonial officials depending on the Crown for salaries. We control the salaries of our royal officials, not the Parliament. It objected to keeping standing armies in the colonies and called it, once again, as repeated and as a refrain from the Suffolk Resolves, the idea that the Coercive Acts were unconstitutional. And you can't dissolve assemblies. Colonial governors, you can't do it. They were already meeting illegally for the most part. And the Declaration of Rights did something also. This would be, again, in this area of their statement, where they were going to take the next step done by the Continental Congress applying to all of the different colonies. First, the Declaration of Rights called for non-importation. There you go, colony-wide boycott of British goods. They also called for non-exportation. That was something new. That would be American products, cash crops, would not leave England after 1774, would not leave for England after 1774. Of course, to have non-importation, you were going to have enforcement. So they called for some kind of association. Continental associations would be used to enforce non-importation. What does that mean? To say it differently, neighbors checking up on neighbors, making sure that goods that currently were in warehouses wouldn't be sold. You wouldn't import more British goods. You wouldn't put it on your shelf. If you did, you're running a risk of your own personal safety. So this was debated and then approved by the Continental Congress. Now, there was debate about the whole non-export issue because they talked about it, importation, fine. As of a certain day, we're not going to import British goods any longer. But then the Virginians and South Carolinians and Georgians said, the Georgians weren't there, but South Carolina said, look, Georgia's going to object to this as well. We have rice and tobacco waiting to export. You know, it's fall 1774. Can we kind of not invoke the whole non-export till the following year? and members from outside the South said, okay, fine. If you agree, starting in 1775, I mean, they want to, profits are all important here. Their political statement is one thing, but they said, all right, we'll allow you to export 1774's crop, but 1775, we really mean the non-exportation will go into effect, to which South Carolina says, and rice? And rice can be exempt, but you see there, it's not exactly unified as far as that statement of purpose there. But at least they're on the same page about non-importation. They also, again, talk about the establishment of these continental associations. These are going to be a real thing. Finally, and most importantly, they agree they're going to meet again. This might be, non-importation is important, the forming of the continental associations. But they agree to meet again. If their grievances were not redressed by someone, the English people, the English Parliament coming to their senses, as some would hope, or the king, they will have another meeting scheduled for May 1775. We know what happens in the intervening months, right? A shooting starts in Lexington and Concord in April 1775. And then you have a Congress that's a war Congress. It looks like more and more. Few people want to make the formal break with Great Britain here. Few people. Only some. And I mean Massachusetts, a couple in Virginia. South Carolina delegate is using the I word, but they know they can't do that yet because there's a general agreement, even among the radicals, that we've made our statement. We've reacted in turn. We've established our position about the coercive acts. We told England what we will do if you don't change your mind. Non-importation, non-exportation. The formation after this meeting adjourns. Now we're at the end of October 1774. We're going to meet again. But we're also going to establish, to make sure that there is non-importation and it is a reality, we're going to establish continental associations. And I'm going to leave with this because this connects directly to the birth of the insurgency in the fall of 1774. Continental associations will stop imports and exports, and they will enforce non-consumption of British goods, meaning everything that's there. So you're going to not get more things from England. You're going to have a boycott of British goods, but the boycott's immediate. If you've got stuff in different warehouses in stores throughout the different colonial cities, you're not going to consume those things. So it's non-consumption, meaning that's it across the board. December 1st, no consumption of English goods. We'll also stop the slave trade. Why? Slavery is bad? No, not for that reason. I'd like to think that might be the case. But if they stop the international slave trade, the price of slaves will go up. And those who are in the colonies who sell slaves to each other, one slave owner to another, realized driving the price of slaves up would be a good thing. But I think it was all part of that discipline that needed to happen in the area of closing the Atlantic trade, which includes now the Atlantic slave trade. They did everything in the Continental Associations. This was a statement that came out of the Congress. This was going to be binding what these 12 colonies did in Philadelphia when they adjourned on the colonies. They said things like, we're going to discourage horse racing, or some of the things that had got us into, and the Southerners more than anyone else realized this, we're in a perpetual cycle of debt. Oh no, what do we do? Well, stop buying English stuff and getting further and further into debt. So they say we're not going to have horse races, no cockfighting anymore, and plays, just drama will be stopped. No plays done because all of that shows frugality. They're taking a page from Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. You know, let us be dutiful children, but at the same time, tighten the belts, not consume. Frugality. This is all part of frugality. They're also going to observe that people follow the dictates of the non-importation and non-consumption agreements. Hey, friend, you just get yourself a new tea set? Yeah. You hear about this non-importation, non-consumption agreement? Yeah. Names will be named. They'll be listed. They'll be called out in public. They'll be printed in newspapers. We're going to see this more of the insurgency, but that's what the enforcement is. That's the Continental Association. I mean, Gage already sees what's happening before the Continental Congress meets. They are arming themselves. You know, when the Continental Congress met, the early thing that they talked about, and this was a rumor, was that Gage's soldiers had fired on and killed about a half dozen people. It was part of what's called the powder alarm. I'll read about that in the Philbrick book. But part of that was that a rumor, not true, it's a rumor, that about a half dozen Massachusetts colonists had been killed in a military skirmish with Gage's soldiers. It wasn't true. The rumors were quickly, again, done away with, but they met, they gathered, and it takes a lot of time for people from South Carolina to get to Philadelphia in 1774, but they gathered under that cloud. It turned out not to be true, but it proved to a lot of folks the necessity of beginning to, and Gage sees this too, identify the military stores and make sure you and the British Army have them and the resistance doesn't have them. And now back to Gage. I'll conclude with this, which is directly from, I have to read it in its entirety because it's really good. It sets the mindset and gives you an idea of what's going to happen next. This is from the American Revolution podcast. Many people, including John Adams, talk about the revolution having begun before the first shots were fired. These events are examples of what we're talking about, everything we've covered up to this point and will continue to talk about. British authorities were quite frankly shocked that the whole people could rise up, not rallying around a particular leader, but around the idea of freedom. Throughout the empire and in England, too, for that matter, most people were peasants who did not have the luxury to care about anything other than where their next meal is coming from. Most were bound to a lord, meaning a manor lord, who controlled the land that they worked. If the lord decided to rebel, the people rebelled with him. If the lord was loyal to the crown, the people remained loyal. They certainly would not, on their own, stand up against the regular army ready to fire on them. America, especially New England, was very different. Land ownership was widespread. Most men owned their own farms or could look forward to doing so someday. They had taken part in a town meeting all their lives and were used to the idea of governing by a consensus of the population, not orders from up above. They had grown up on the idea that they had to defend their basic rights or liberties and that they needed to be well armed in order to make sure that those liberties were not taken from them. Passage of the Coercive Acts had led to a consensus among the vast majority of New England colonists that taking up arms was necessary. General Gage and officials in London had no idea how to contend with such a force. They could not arrest and hang a few leaders. They were not ready to commit genocidal rampage and murder across the entire colony. They had no experience trying to negotiate with a large group of commoners. Over the next couple of years, they would certainly do their best to try to suppress the rebellion militarily, but they simply did not have the experience and tools to overcome a well-armed, motivated population of commoners dedicated to protecting their liberties. Gage is going to try, though. He gets orders from his ministers and advisors and his bosses back in England. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. But it's now the winter of 1774. His soldiers are in winter quarters. He'll be aggressive in the spring, he figures. He's not going to get more soldiers. They're going to tell him to, with 4,000 or so soldiers now, they send him more by the beginning of 1775, end this. He doesn't think he can. So next time what we're going to talk about is the birth of the insurgency. This is a concept that begins really in the reaction to the Coercive Acts and continues over the next several months until we get to, obviously, the Second Continental Congress. But the fact that they called a meeting, held it, made a statement, sent this over to petition over to England, and then said, we're going to meet again. They didn't plan on what was going to happen in the intervening months. There'd be bloodshed at Lexington and Concord.